This is Caroline from Caroline's Adventure. We all face challenges in our lives. How do some people take those challenges and turn them into powerful results? Join me as we dig into a story on resilience, hope, and joy, and uncover lessons we can each use in our own lives. But before we start, please take a moment to show that 5-star rating button some love, and follow while you're there to be updated every time I release a new episode. Now, before we begin, a word of caution. On this podcast, we regularly discuss topics like sexual assault, suicide, and addiction, which may be disturbing to some. Please take care as you listen. And if you need support in the United States, reach out to the crisis text line at 741-741. A special note about today's interview. Today, we talk with AnneMoss Rogers, who lost her son to death by suicide in 2015. This led to AnneMoss becoming an advocate and public speaker on the subject of self-harm. If this is a sensitive subject for you, please take care while listening to this episode. You are so accomplished, and I was just reading through your bio. I was like, damn, girl, got it going on. Like you are out there doing the thing. It's amazing. You're in Virginia?
I am. Richmond.
So,
we have a lot of resources here, but some of the rural areas, they have nothing, and we're it.
Well, I know between there and West Virginia, there's a huge amount of death from opioids and suicide from opioids. I have a friend who used to do intake in the emergency rooms there, and it's easy sitting here. I live right outside DC, and I don't see it as much. And so, talking with him about how constant the supply was, what you do is probably incredibly important there.
We'll be going to Ohio, which is right next to West Virginia. And of course, that's the issue they're having. So we're going to talk about, the tragic link between addiction and suicide, because a lot of people don't know it.
I didn't at all.
Well, that's how my son died. He became addicted to heroin, and then he felt useless and worthless, and that just added to that. And then while he was going through withdrawal, he took his life.
It's one of those where when I was a teenager, I thought heavily about suicide, and I sat with my mom's gun a couple of times and played with the idea of it, and and I'm so grateful I didn't do it. But I can understand already being low and being at your most raw and your most vulnerable, and then having the pain of withdrawal on top of that. I can't even imagine.
Well, that's why I tell people, if you can, remove your firearms, but people have a real emotional connection.
There's, I think, this fallacy that if you have firearms and you hide them, kids won't know where they are. Kids are nosy. I mean, my mom, I'm sure to this day she has no idea that I knew exactly where it was, or that I sat several times and thought about it. And I mean, it was loaded. I was at that point. And
yeah, and that is it. It's lethal means.
It's hard as a parent, because it is that constant balancing act of, how do I stay completely engaged? I've got kids that are nearing the age that I was when I was in such a dark place, and their life circumstances are very different than mine was. But I also know that I don't think anyone knew how low I was. I've always been really good at
masking.
Yeah. And I doubt my mother knows to this day. We don't have a relationship any longer, but I doubt she has any idea. And I would go, here's how I thought I was. I would go into the bathroom, because I was like, okay, if it happens, I would sit on the ledge to the shower. It'll be a much cleaner, easier cleanup. And this was before the internet, so it wasn't like I was watching CSI or researching it, I was just thinking through the logistics of, okay, what will make this the least impactful, quick, done. And so as a mother, it's hard to know how, what do you recommend? How involved do you get in your children's world, and how much do you...
How old are they?
My daughter's 13, my son is 12 and a half.
Well, I would find a way to kind of, if somebody dies by suicide, or there's one in the media, start that conversation by saying, gosh, he looks so happy, but, he struggled, and be vulnerable with, you don't have to go into the gun and all the specifics, but, I remember as a teen struggling with suicide, and with this happening, and the fact that I did think very seriously about it once. I have to ask you, are you thinking of suicide?
No.
Have you ever thought about it? And that's the conversation you have with your kid.
That's smart. And
and it doesn't plant the idea in their head. And what you'll usually see is relief, and just say, if at any time you are struggling with those thoughts, I won't judge you. I won't tell you something ridiculous like you're trying to get attention. I will work with you to figure out what that next step is. I'm not an expert, but we'll work together, and I won't leave you out of the process, and I won't pass judgment. I'll just, we'll figure that out together. So you want to let them know, I'm not going to call, 911 off the bat. Now, if they've taken something, that's a 911 call to save their life. You want to put more time between thought and action, because those suicidal episodes peter out. So when you felt that way, you wanted to do it, and you probably went kind of like this: I really want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. I really want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. And then it just kind of faded away, and you're like, I don't feel like that anymore.
Yeah, that's very true. And I honestly believe, for me, that I aged out of it, but having the time to age out of it. And one of the points that you made that is so true, I talk very openly with my kids about so many topics. We talk about alcohol, we talk about drugs, we talk about, people that may want to get them to do things or touch them or whatever. We talk about drunk driving. I've never thought to talk with them openly about any kind of self-harm. And that is, you're right, that needs to be a topic of discussion as well.
And then, if given the ages, it's likely they know someone in middle school who is self-harming.
That's very possible.
And I have kids reach out to me who want to stop.
Yeah.
And they've stopped on their own, and their parent has never even known that they're self-harming.
Yeah.
And they use the self-harm safety dot. So, they'll email me back and forth. And through email, I'm like, okay, what are you using? You need to take that when you are not in a moment of distress and put it somewhere far away, or get rid of it. However, whatever works for you. But don't keep it in your room, because that gives you access. And if you put it up in the attic, by the time you get to the attic, oftentimes you don't want to do it anymore, because that feeling will fade. And then you will lapse and make some errors, and that's okay. That's part of the process. And then they make this thing called the self-harm safety box, where they can use a rubber band and snap it to kind of create that sort of sense of pain that they understand, or pictures or letters to themselves, but it's their own thing. And I've had kids from all over the world write me and go, this worked for me. It took me a while, but I stuck with it. But giving them their own agency in that process is what is so important. When we, as parents, want to take over, we want to do this, we want to do that, but letting them and when they have that hesitation, Like, I don't want to go to the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And you're like, huh, well, today's the day, but I don't want to, I'm not going to force you. But I would be interested in why I don't want to go. Well, and let's say that, and they say, well, they'll give me a drug that takes away my personality, my creativity. Well, I wouldn't want that for you.
Yeah.
I don't think they do, but that's a good question. Can you write down that question? And can you ask the doctor that? So you're giving them agency in their own mental health. And you're saying, well, I'm interested in the answer to that too.
Yeah.
And then, here's the deal. Can we go to the appointment, ask those questions? And I think I have to make a promise to you that I'm not going to make you take something that you're not willing to take.
Yeah. Yeah. That's huge.
Right. And because they sort of start to feel helpless, and we need to give them their power back.
Yeah.
And, you being a little bit vulnerable, like, don't go telling them about the whole gun thing. You can say, I'm not really ready to talk about the whole thing because I haven't processed that myself. But I can tell you I really struggled, and I came way too close.
Good. That's really good. One of the things that I love is that you took what, as a mother, I can only imagine being the hardest thing.
It's still awful.
I can't even imagine losing my child, let alone losing my child to suicide. And you turn that into such a beautiful outreach to help other kids and other people that are in that place. And so you're helping other moms not feel that, and you're helping save people with your own experience. And that is it's such an amazingly beautiful gift to give, but it's also like the amount of strength that it must take to dig into that over and over and over again, and to go through that with other people is amazing.
I think for me, it was how I moved forward. And it's like I couldn't not do that. And I tell people, just go in a direction. It may be the wrong direction, but when you go to the wrong direction, you can figure out later which is the right direction. You just have to try stuff on right now.
Absolutely.
So then I decided that's when I kind of build on the speaking thing and the training thing. And all this time I was taking training, and because I didn't want to talk about suicide until I was adequately trained. I already knew a lot about addiction, so I could talk about that, but the intersection between the two, I wasn't as comfortable with. Now, a lot of people will talk about all this stuff without that training. And that's not a good idea.
I'll say that would scare me. I'd be afraid that I would mess something up.
Yeah, and there is some specific messaging that we need to carry forward. I mean, we don't want to be too specific or graphic about attempts, and because that can be potentially activating to other members of the audience who may be living every day with chronic suicidality, because there are people among us who, from the age of 8 years old, have thought about suicide every single day of their lives since then. And that's a lot of work to manage to compartmentalize it, to take away its power, to understand that thought doesn't become action. But when life becomes really overwhelming, guess what? That becomes more difficult. And it's really that people's brains are just configured differently when it comes to stress response. It could be that that person was born that way. That could be part of it. The health history and environment is really what it's about. It could be that there's a trauma history adding to that. It could be that there's somebody had a head injury or scarlet fever, or it could be really anything that is added to that equation. So everybody's makeup and story is different, but their stress response is different. And that system can get overwhelmed when you are emotionally overwhelmed, and it can feel like that is the only choice we have.
Yeah.
Your brain is telling you the only way to stop the pain is to kill yourself.
Yeah.
It's not true. Your brain is lying to you, but there are some people who have to have some kind of methodology of reaching out to short circuit that thought process. So a friend of mine named Ginger never struggled with thoughts of suicide in her entire life. Her son took his life, and she has struggled ever since. Well, she knows she has to stay alive. She has other family. She has people who love her. And she, she will live because she feels obligated to live at certain periods in her life. But her thing is, when she starts to feel that way, she starts to recognize the signs. And if her partner is out of town, what she does is she's got a list of girlfriends. She calls like 8. Who can come over, or can I come over there? I just don't need to be alone tonight.
Yeah.
And then that's how she manages to work through those episodes. And fortunately, she's got a network of people. Now, it doesn't happen often enough that she has to call, one person 5 times, so she gets to spread it out. But that process has worked for her. And I think all of us should plan ahead for that time when life is gonna throw you curveballs.
Yes, it does.
And it's gonna get overwhelming at times. How are you gonna handle it when life explodes in your face? I know how you're gonna handle it when you win the lottery. You're gonna be real happy. But how are you gonna handle it when life explodes in your face? I mean, who are you gonna call? Are you gonna isolate? And we don't want to isolate. We want to make sure we reach out. It's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of great courage, because being vulnerable in front of other people, hardest thing you'll ever do.
Yes.
I remember the newspaper article I wrote after my son's death. It felt so good to write. It took months to write. But when they called me to tell me it was published,
yeah.
I almost had my first panic attack. I had to pull over to the side of the road, and having coached Charles, my younger child, through it so many times, I knew that the deep breathing worked. And then in my head, I went through that inventory of fears. What are you afraid of, AnneMoss? And I was like, all my clients will walk away because I'm a terrible mom. And then it was like, I can live with that, because if someone decides that I don't count because it's happened in my life, do I really want them as a client in the first place?
I love that. I mean, that is so true of standing in your truth with anything. That's part of what this podcast is about, is giving people an opportunity to stand in their truth that have never done it before, and helping others who are struggling with that challenge have the courage because they see it in someone else. And it's amazing how freeing it is.
Oh, it's so liberating.
It is so liberating. And
that was the time I let it all go. It was like, my biggest fear was that no one would read the article, and that they would forget he existed, and that he didn't count, and that by their not reading, it would feel like I buried them all over again. And it went viral, so that didn't happen, but that was my real fear. All the rest of them I could work through, and that one I had to come to terms. It was like, it's already out there. And what happens. And maybe they won't read it, but I spoke my truth, and maybe it's going to be a lot more difficult. And it went viral, and all of a sudden I had followers when I didn't even know what followers exactly were.
But it shows how powerful you sharing that message was, because you reached so many people in a place that they felt alone, and oh God, the way that it resonated so deeply with so many, and so many people reached out to you and followed you from that, shows you how very needed that voice was. And
at that time, no one was speaking out about it. And this is just 2015 or early 2016. You really couldn't find a lot of information from people with lived experience. And there was one video from NC State University, a university I work with, by the way, on mental health initiatives. And it was a video they had done about suicide that was the only thing I could find. And I had to learn everything I could, but I could get all the scientific studies. I could talk to people. I could talk to parents whose children had attempted, because they would reach out to me. What I had a hard time finding was the people with lived experience, like you talked about earlier. They started to come to my website because I put out certain posts that I knew they looked up in Google, and then I didn't give them the directions. So you might call that clickbait. And I've had people say, hey, this clickbait saved my life.
But then that's huge.
Yeah. But I needed to hear the stories. And so I went to an overnight walk up where you are in Washington, D.C. And I volunteered instead of just participating in the walk. And my mantra all day was, what brings you here? What brings you here? So at first I was meeting people who had lost someone. I get on the bus to go, I was doing midnight snack and we're gonna go set it up. And I get on the bus, I'm like, I'm not sitting with anybody I know, I'm just gonna sit with a stranger. And I sat with this young lady, and I looked at her and said, what brings you here today? Silence. She turns around, she looks out the window, and I'm like, oh gosh. Took a deep breath. I kept my mouth shut. I said nothing, because I felt like she was processing something, but I wasn't sure. And at the same time, that voice in my head, why did you ask that? I'm like, shh, just shut up. Yes. And it was probably 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour. And then she turned around and she said, I attempted suicide 2 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And she proceeded to tell me the whole story. And then when we got off the bus, she said, thanks for listening. I've never told anyone that story before. And she said, you never interrupted, you never judged. And I know your son loved you. And she gave me a hug. And the rest of the time, it was like I was a magnet. All the people with lived experience just sort of felt my vibe.
Yes, I totally agree.
But that was a huge learning experience for me. Was, I had all the training, I'd had all that stuff. I needed that component where I talked to actual people who had been through it, because I needed to understand my boy. Yeah. He had left music, so I did have his words to help me understand, but I needed to know more.
Yeah.
And that was kind of that, okay, now I can start to talk about this. I've had all the training. I'm now a certified trainer. And now I've talked to people with lived experience, and it's been thousands at this point.
So beautiful. And one thing that you mentioned that is easy to forget, but it's so critical, and that's to shut up. Yeah, it's funny because I've worked in sales jobs over the years. I've done marketing, I've done PR. And one of the things that when I'm doing any interview, whether it's a sales pitch or whatever, I like to write the words "shut up" at the top of my page, because it is our human instinct when there's silence to want to fill it. And yes, and that taking the moment and letting the silence give them time to breathe and then let them start. It's such a powerful thing. And so you sitting there in your discomfort on that bus and giving her the time to come to you and open the discussion is so powerful.
It really is. I discovered that in Families Anonymous, and I was doing that pretty well with my son. And that's why he ended up confessing to be addicted to an opiate. I didn't know it was heroin at the time. But he, that's the furthest he'd ever come, the closest he'd ever come to telling me. And he said he needed help. But the only reason he did is after he told me his wild story, he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "That's some story." Then I shut up and I didn't say another thing. And I waited, and he wasn't used to that. So you do that with your teenagers. When you feel like you want to dive into a lecture, and by the way, lecture never works. So I stopped that completely. I have not lectured since my oldest child was 17 years old. And I had them help me by telling me when I gave them unsolicited advice.
That's huge.
That's not my job.
Yeah, and that's such an empowering thing to do. I read a quote a long time ago, and it said, "Get curious." Instead of saying, "I am the expert, let me tell you how to do this," slow down and get curious and just ask the open-ended questions and let them. It goes back to what you said before, which is giving them agency in the process.
And if you want to give that a label, it's called, motivational interviewing.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, there's actually a course you can take to build that skill. But I always say listen more and lecture less. And then the second thing is ask more questions. So they come home, they did lousy in the test, instead of telling them what they should do, to say, "Wow, you really looked so disappointed. I'm really sorry about that. What do you think you'll do differently next time?" And not in an accusing or judgmental way, just like, with curiosity. What do you think you're going to do next time? You don't start sending them articles or, "Oh, let's get your study guide," or, you can't say, "Whatever I can do to support you, I'd be happy to do that." You'll figure out a plan. I know you will. But giving them that confidence that they can't figure it out, because guess what? They can.
Well, and that's, it's interesting because when you are giving someone the guidance to follow, it requires them to then buy into it and follow through. When you help them come to their own plan, they've already bought into it because they're giving you what the plan is, and they no longer have to buy into it because it's their plan, and it increases the likelihood of them actually following through.
Right. Well, I love to plant seeds.
Yes, I love
I do a lot of planting seeds, and that's worked out really well.
Well, and lots of times it's the taken the wrong course that you learn from.
There's so many things that when they're little that let them make the decision. Let them wear their daggone pajamas to preschool. Who cares?
Yes. Like, if you're fighting with them constantly, it erodes that trust in that relationship.
And at some point, you just have to let some of them go and let them learn the hard way.
Yes, that is my experience with Bennett. Like, I, on a routine basis, have to sit back and be like, okay, what's the worst that can happen if I just let him go? And it's a constant, it's exhausting.
We learn from failure. We learn from our mistakes. We learn that's where our most valuable lessons come from. And
yes.
Those kids who are perfectionists, we have to set that expectation as parents and teachers that you're going to fail.
Yes.
And that's where we learn. I fail all the time, and it's okay, because really success is, all the lessons I've learned from a bunch of failures.
Well, and the failures are where you get the best education from.
Right.
It is part of the process. And I think that we as a society don't do a good job of letting people see us fail.
When my first son died by suicide, I thought, well, nothing says epic failure like your son killed himself, and I wore that label for a really long time. That's not my truth. You can't control the actions of another.
Yeah.
And as unfortunate as it was, there's more to me than just that incident. I've raised another son, and the night Charles died, I don't know where he got this or how he came up with this. He was only 22, and he goes, I was raised in the same household, and you all were great parents, and I was an amazing family life, and
oh wow,
you couldn't have helped or known about this. And I mean, this is my 22-year-old, and this is the night that I called him with the information, and I'm like, how did he know to say that? Well, he has no idea the impact that one paragraph had. I mean, we were just stunned. It was on speaker, and my husband and I were like, there wasn't anything you could have said in that moment that would have meant more than what came out of my older son's mouth that night. And that's really actually quite rare. When somebody tells you they're suicidal, they usually are.
Well, and it's hard as a parent, because when they've gotten to that point, I could be wrong on this, but in the times that I have experienced it with friends, it's not the first time that they've dragged their family to that place and been, just so down and been incredibly emotional. And so it's easy. I have a good friend that committed suicide in college, and it was one of those things where by the time that it happened, it felt sudden, but he had also been so high and so low so many times that people were exhausted. It was such a roller coaster. So I can't,
you got to give yourself credit for all the times that you may have thwarted or prevented suicide in the past, because I think I did. I think there were times my son didn't kill himself.
Yeah.
Because of some unknown intervention by me.
Yeah.
I know that's why my son had pictures of the family taped to the wall. Mm-hmm. And he had them right next to his bed when he felt more vulnerable, because he wanted to remind himself why he was staying alive.
There's so much pressure in our society to be always on. And I was there, I just to give a sample, I grew up in abuse. I grew up in neglect, in severe poverty. I was the dirty kid. And I grew up feeling so much shame and so much embarrassment about that. But it's not until I started opening up and talking about it freely that it's given other people permission to open up and share their stories with me. And for me, it's funny how when you start owning your truth openly, it takes the sting out of it. You know, people can say whatever they want to about my past now. I own it. So it takes all the power out of it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what else is very liberating is that all we can do is the best we can do, right?
Yes.
And those who are conscientious really are just trying to do the best we can.
I really am blown away at how you've taken such a deeply painful experience and found a way to help others and really make it a very powerful movement that you're like, this is just amazing.
I mean, I didn't become strong without there being people I leaned on along the way.
Yeah.
I had to be willing, but I also had to be willing to accept and ask for help, which was not easy for me to do.
I hear you on that one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I've loved this. And keep doing the wonderful work that you're doing, because this is amazing.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for reaching out. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Caroline's Adventure podcast. While you're here, subscribe to the show so you're the first to catch new episodes when they're released. And if you enjoyed hanging out with me today, please leave a 5-star rating. For links to social media and more content, visit the description for this episode or go to carolinesadventure.com. That's Caroline with 2 A's, adventure.com.